Welcome to Beyond the Microphone, a podcast about podcasters and the stories of how their shows came together, grew, and what they discovered along the way. I'm your host, Adam Baruh. So as we get started here today, I'd like to talk a little bit about making mistakes and this notion of chasing perfection. A lot of people that I speak to that are creative types, whether it's about podcasting or wanting to launch a business or whatever, I've had people come to me and I could tell that, something holding them back from actually getting started is this notion of like needing everything, all your ducks in a row, like everything kind of planned out before you execute. And that's really tough. I've been an entrepreneur for a while. I've been running my main company for 7 years, and I probably side more with just less research and less prep and just getting into it. Now, I've 100% made many mistakes that way, but the point is like I've gone for it, and then I've evolved over time, and I think that's how kind of most people kind of operate, and it's very acceptable to kind of go that route. Now, if you're the type of person where you like want to do a ton of research and kind of have a lot planned out from a detailed perspective, but you're the type of person that still has the ability to execute, then by all means that strategy is probably going to work well for you. But I find that it has been a barrier with many people that have approached me, and they've been kind of like working on a concept for years, and they're just like, what do I do to get started, right? Well, and I tell them every time, stop chasing perfection, just go for it. You'll figure it out along the way. I mean, as an entrepreneur, I think the number one thing that you realize over time is that you can never really truly prepare for anything. I mean, what you can prepare for are things like your mindset and your ability to problem solve. That's where, you should probably want to spend your time like preparing for some new venture, because, what you'll find in business and in podcasting is, the landscape is always changing. For example, the last year, AI's been all the rage, ChatGPT. And so, whereas you might have kind of had one way of doing it when you got started, you better have the ability to read the landscape and pivot and, just evolve over time. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that notion of, being mistake-free, really having all your ducks in a row before you execute. Yes, you may have like a cleaner execution if you get there. So that's really the point I wanted to make. Just something to think about as you're, people that are listening that are considering launching their podcasts. I didn't have it all figured out when I got into it, and I've just been learning over time, and it's seemingly worked for me. And that, I know it's just me, but just something to think about as you get started. So with that, let's go ahead and introduce our guest here today. His name is Mark Graban, and he's the host of the podcast, My Favorite Mistake, where you'll hear CEOs, executives, entrepreneurs, and other interesting people discuss their favorite mistakes and what they learned, including how to prevent making the same mistakes again, or how to turn apparent mistakes into something positive. My Favorite Mistake has a listen score of 34 and is ranked in the top 3%. So well done with that, Mark. He's also the author of the recently released book, The Mistakes That Make Us, Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation, an engaging, inspiring, and practical book that presents an alternative approach to mistakes. Rather than punishing individuals for human error and bad decision, Graban encourages us to embrace and learn from them, fostering a culture of learning and innovation. So with that, Mark, welcome to Beyond the Microphone.
Adam, hi. Thanks for having me here.
I'm really happy that you're here today, and I love this subject because as we go forward in our discussion here today, I'd like to, hear about some of the mistakes that you've made and how they've shaped where, you're at today. Because certainly I've made, and I'm like happy to discuss, some of the really key ones in my own experience that have, resulted in where I'm at today. So why don't we start with, how did you get inspired and interested in this work? I mean, did it all kind of stem from some big mistake and you kind of decided to really become curious about that and make it your life's work? Tell us a little bit about the early kind of, how you got into this type of work and interest.
Yeah. Well, so when I started the My Favorite Mistake podcast, first episodes were released September 2020. It wasn't because of any single life-changing mistake. It was just, I think, an accumulation of countless mistakes and kind of a long building fascination with that, not just as individuals, but in a workplace culture. Now, you talk about not having it all figured out when you started. I started my first podcast in the summer of 2006.
Okay,
wow. A podcast kind of based on my kind of professional background in an area that we might call lean management, or it's similar. The lean startup methodology is kind of an offshoot of that. I started doing that interviews, format podcast in 2006, and we can talk about some of them. Made many mistakes along the way, but I'd like to think I've learned from them, and like the major mistakes haven't been repeated, knock on wood. And there's some tools though that I use that go beyond just hoping not to repeat the mistakes. But I had an opportunity. There was some happenstance here. So, I mean, pandemic times, I wasn't able to travel for work. I was doing what I could, working from home, but I was looking for some other projects to just take my mind off of pandemic times in Los Angeles. And so I had been doing this lean podcast long enough where maybe the same for you or a lot of the listeners, Adam, you get pitched by lots of PR folks. They have, somebody's got a book out, they need to be on your show. Well, my podcast is very, very niche. Like, I don't often find it a fit, with one of these pitched guests. I'm reaching out and finding people who have written books in this space or other, other accomplishments. But a PR person had reached out with the opportunity to interview Kevin Harrington, who isn't one of the most famous sharks from Shark Tank, but he was on season 1. And he had a book coming out, and I thought, wow, I would really like to meet him and talk with him. Like, for me, podcasting has been a great networking tool.
Yeah.
And I followed up with the PR person and said, well, help me figure out a way to say yes. I'm thinking of starting a new, like, broader business podcast, and I spitballed a few ideas. One would have been so generic, like the Mark Graban show, where we could talk about anything business related. And then I also had this idea, like, how about a podcast about mistakes? I'm a big Sheryl Crow fan, and her song "My Favorite Mistake," which I think using that name as the podcast was a little bit of a mistake. But anyway, I pitched this, and Kevin Harrington was cool enough to be able to come on and tell an amazing favorite mistake story. And so with that, I'm like, okay, wow, that's my launch guest. Now the question was, could I find more people? Everyone loves sharing their success stories, but I think it's really cool when really successful people are willing to share a favorite mistake story the way Kevin did.
Oh yeah, and because it makes it real. We all make mistakes, and one of the things, I've got these books right here. I'm looking to see if I have one to put on the screen. I actually have one handy right here. There's this book that, as a business leader, I used to use it more often, but it's StrengthsFinder 2.0 by Don Clifton, and it's not a book that you would read. It's more of kind of like a reference, but at the end of the book, there's this little quiz, like a code that you go online, take this 30-minute self-assessment, and it comes back and generates this report on your top 5 strengths. And what I think is really cool about that approach is, I think we spend a lot of time focusing more on what we're not good at and trying to improve in those areas where we're not naturally gifted or naturally skilled, and trying to improve those areas. I think the notion of this book and this philosophy is, rather than spending all this time on trying to fix what we're not great at, let's actually take that same amount of time and accentuate our strengths. This kind of stay in our strength zone. We'll find more success that way. So, why do you think as a society we, look at our mistakes more. We look at what we're not good at and we try to fix those areas versus, the more kind of positive approach, which is, the focus on the strengths and what we are good at.
Yeah. And it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm trying to frame, through the podcast and now through the book, that learning from mistakes is a very positive thing. Like, it could be one of our strengths as an individual, as a leader, as a company. We are good at learning from mistakes, right? So I think the thing that I'm trying to help shift people away from is like this really negative, judgmental view of mistakes and shaming people for them, or punishing them in a workplace. That a mistake, if we are in an environment, like say in a workplace setting where it's psychologically safe to admit that you made a mistake, you get a constructive, helpful response from your colleagues and your leader, then we're in a place where we can actually think about, well, why did this mistake happen? Was it a slip up? Was there a bad assumption? What type of mistake was it? But we can focus on understanding what happened, not who messed up, but what happened and why. And then think of what actions are we going to take in the future to prevent that mistake or something worse from happening in the future. So, I mean, I don't think a focus on learning from mistakes is negative or dwelling on faults, because like you said, we all make mistakes. Like, we have no choice about that, but we do have a choice in how we react and what we do after the mistake.
Yeah, and so
again, I think it's a positive.
I think I agree with you on that, and I think we're entering this age where it's becoming okay. Like, much to what you're saying, like, it's normalizing the mistake. Like, it's normalizing, or just, I guess, like, having a culture in place in more and more companies. When you are on like LinkedIn, you look at messages from people like Gary Vee, the leading with empathy, the like team first type of messaging and content. That was very motivating for me when I started my first podcast, The Change. It was all about servant leadership, team first, normalizing the mental health conversation in the workplace. So looking at like a lot of the changes that have occurred where, I think to your point, like, more and more companies really are understanding now the value of creating that culture that is supportive of, helping people, whether it's a mistake they made just because of some technical skill set mismatch, or maybe they're dealing with something in their personal lives. But, what do you think it is over the last, do you think it was pandemic inspired that really kind of fueled this movement in companies to create more, I guess, empathetic approaches to how they're managing their team?
That's a good question. I mean, it's hard to speak to those broader issues, but I mean, some of it could be. I mean, I think the movement is still building. Like, is it a movement? There's positive signs. There are some companies where this is true, that mistakes are not driven underground, because the organization reacts with openness and constructive reaction to it. But I mean, I think some of the benefits or some of the arguments to lead this way or to build this kind of culture come down to employee retention. In the last couple of years, maybe the so-called Great Resignation has subsided a little bit, but there's still a real battle for talent, and culture can really be a competitive strength for an organization to attract talent and then let them come and thrive and support them and make sure they're a good fit with the job, and have them be part of that culture of learning from mistakes and a culture of innovation. They're going to want to stay. And then I think when we're not pressuring people into hiding and covering up mistakes, then we can actually improve. We can provide better customer service. We can be more innovative. It's not just nice. We're looking to drive better business results, but it goes hand in hand. So that's part of the case I'm trying to make, I think, through the podcast, through the book. If there are people out there, it's not an if, there are some people out there who still think, man, you got to punish mistakes, or otherwise you're creating a permissive environment where people are going to just make more mistakes. And I'm like, people feel bad when they make a mistake, right? So to react with empathy and to be supportive, I think it's good business. I'm hoping others would get on board with that.
Yeah, and I want to speak to this a little bit from my own experience too, because I am an employer. I have 20 or so employees that I manage, and I've definitely evolved over the 7 years of running, my main company, where, like, probably through the pandemic and going into 2021, I really kind of, for myself, decided that I want to be a CEO that advocates for leading with empathy and try to do the things in my own company to support that. And so, this idea of repeating mistakes, like, if it's somebody's first mistake, like, I always tell them, like, try to avoid having fear around making a mistake, because, sometimes those are the greatest teachers. Sometimes that's where we learn the best lessons that help us grow, like, not just, professionally, but personally. I tell my kids that too. It's like, you're going to make mistakes, like, try to learn from them. And then, it just happens sometimes where you have employees and they do, like, these things come up again. And I mean, where's that fine line? Because at some point, I think you do have to manage that, right? Like, you want to start out probably with more of an empathetic approach, but, what can you recommend, or what have you seen in your research that's useful for employers and managers to how to kind of navigate that kind of repeating mistake event?
So, I mean, there's two pieces that you need. One I've already touched on, psychological safety. People have to feel safe being able to say, I don't know, I could be wrong, I made a mistake, to be able to point that out without fear of punishment. But the second thing that's critical, it's a different PS, problem solving, right? So I think if an organization it decides they're going to be non-punitive, okay, that's probably better, because now people won't be hiding mistakes, but we don't want people to feel safe bringing up the same mistakes over and over again. So if there are repeated mistakes, I would say, instead of that being a sign of individual failure or weakness, I mean, well, maybe the organization needs to do a better job at problem solving, instead of just saying, well, be careful. You probably won't do that again. You've learned your lesson. Like, putting things into place, checklists. I use checklists with my podcasts and webinars, different, what you might call mistake proofing techniques, a concept that comes from Toyota and the lean methodology. So when you have, effective problem solving, that's where we can actually, I think, do a better job of making sure the mistakes don't come back. Because really, look, mistakes are bad. I mean, if there's a bad impact on the business or the customer, I'm not discounting that at all. But I just think we need that effective problem solving that allows us to prevent, like, for example, like, one time out of 750 people I've interviewed in different podcasts, one time I forgot to hit record. I hope that never happens to you, Adam. But I fessed up to it. I didn't. I told the guest. I don't even remember offhand who it was. I didn't blame whatever technical gremlins. I mean, I just I forgot to hit record.
Yeah.
And that person was incredibly gracious and said, well, it's all right. Well, we'll call that a practice session, right? But I don't want to do that to people, right? So there's things you can do. You can have a checklist. You can set, if you're using a recording platform, where it starts recording automatically and edit out whatever first part of the conversation you have. I mean, there are different things, either procedurally or technically, we can use to try to prevent repeating a mistake.
Is your work focused mainly in the professional setting, or do you also do a lot of work and research around, in our personal lives, mistakes that we make?
I mean, it's really more, the podcast and the book is more of a workplace book, but, organizations are a collection of people. So there are some things that are intertwined there for sure. But I think there are, commonalities between, software companies that I've been involved in. I've done a lot of consulting in hospitals and healthcare environments, different types of professionals. And I started my career in manufacturing. There's enough human nature and human dynamics that's similar across those organizations. But I think as a leader, and I think of trying to do better in this regard myself. We think of like, when I make a mistake, can I be kinder to myself? Is that part of the journey of being more empathetic and kind when others make mistakes? Can I react to mistakes in ways that are constructive? And so there's a little bit of an individual journey. I've interviewed a number of psychologists on the podcast. Maybe I could partner up with one of them to do more of a personal focused book. But
you brought up you brought up like a really, really powerful gold nugget of information, which really is the way we treat ourselves. Because, I also think this is something that is relatively new, or at least maybe different from, like, if we're let's just stay in the professional setting for now. Like, there was this, and I'm a Gen Xer, and I came up in this era where, there was the culture was very punitive around mistakes, right? And it really, would get wrapped up in then belief systems that, perhaps you're just not good at. I'm just not good at that. I'm, and then feelings of shame and stuff like that come up. And I do think that, there's more and more dialogue around how we talk to ourselves, like our self-talk, and something that, certainly I have dealt with almost throughout my entire career is a lot of negative self-talk, which was wrapped up in a bunch of personal stuff too. But, when you can get to a point now, and there's great techniques for kind of getting there, but, I think that is really the great recipe for managing through and kind of putting an end to where you're repeating mistakes, which is something I call looping, where instead of bashing yourself and beating yourself up, like perhaps getting curious about why, why did these mistakes, why am I repeating this mistake? Like, why does this keep coming up? Like, what is it? What am I supposed to learn? Like, what's the big picture that I'm supposed to learn in this moment, so I can truly once and for all end this cycle? And when you become curious and stop the self-bashing and get into more of like a self-nurturing mode, I find, at least I've found for myself, that's where, just having that curiosity has led to a lot of big revelations about myself that probably did put an end to repeating a lot of these same kind of, mistakes that I was looping on.
Yeah. And one, when it comes to that self-talk, like one lesson, here's something I've learned from interviewing 225 plus people, asking the same question and hearing their story and how they process and think through and remember a mistake and how they move forward from it. I'd have to go back and search transcripts. I'll put a number to it. I don't know, like 25% of my guests, when they're describing their mistake, will use a word like, well, that was a dumb mistake, or that was a stupid mistake. And I kind of cringe. And then that's made me more aware. Like, I caught myself doing this a couple of weeks ago. Like, I was trying to update one of my ebooks in the Amazon Kindle publishing platform. And like my previous book, I went to go upload the new version of that. I had uploaded the file for my new book and realized, like, as soon as I had done it, like, oh, I just uploaded the wrong file. And I caught myself. I was like, oh, that was so dumb. But like, I think being more like, at least I was aware of it, right? I don't know. I probably had a habit of doing that in my life. And I think that reaction, it's not helpful. That self-shaming. I'm not dumb. And I know plenty of smart people who make mistakes all the time, So putting, I think we can try to prevent some mistakes, but we're going to make some. But we do, I think, have more choice, or we can be more mindful of the habits around how we react to mistakes. And I think I'd be less likely to call someone else dumb, but here I was saying it to myself.
No, it's the same. Yeah, no, like we're definitely, we try to avoid, getting into that where we're calling somebody else dumb or whatever, but we do it to ourselves all the time. It makes no sense. And, another thing I love that you just brought up is the awareness part of it, because I truly think that we are in an age right now where self-awareness is really itself becoming a lot more normalized. Mindfulness is a kind of a term that's used a lot and a tool that a lot of people use to reach that higher level of self-awareness. But I'm certainly glad that you brought that up, because I do think that's really the key to work through like what we're supposed to be learning from when we are making mistakes or whatever. It's like, okay, well, no, like what, not just technically what, the mistake that I made, like if it's a very technical thing, what am I supposed to learn there? But sometimes there are, mistakes that we make that if you're self-aware enough, like kind of reveal some like bigger picture things that, again, like I think mistakes, and we're supposed to live a life where we are going to be encountering mistakes and challenges and obstacles. But, the point is not to like solve all these problems in our lives so that we can get to this point in our lives where everything is going to be smooth sailing from there. The point is to reach a level where we become okay with our mistakes, but again, become curious and have a level of self-awareness where, we learn just on a bigger picture level, like what we're supposed to be learning through those mistakes. But, I want to shift a little bit now and kind of bring it back to your podcast. So something that you said earlier on, I wanted to make sure to ask you, you were talking about when you brought in the Shark Tank guy, Kevin, what was his name? I don't watch that show, so I'm not
that's all right.
caught up on all the names. But anyway, so you mentioned about asking people their favorite mistake story, and I wanted to ask you, and we'll kind of scope it to maybe your podcasting work. Do you have can you come up with off the top of your head like your favorite mistake story related to your podcasting work?
Well, there's lots of mistakes. And as I process and think through this, the question's meant to be very open-ended and subjective. Everyone would decide on their own, whatever thought process or mental algorithm, a favorite. I'm not asking people, what's your biggest mistake? I think that's a different question altogether. But, a favorite mistake is one that's big enough that sticks with you and has some sort of lesson. So like in a way, I think I probably already told that story, because I think, the forgetting to record mistake. I think the way, and gosh, I've got to figure out how I can remember exactly who that was. It's a shame that I don't remember more clearly, but I do remember the response of them saying, "It's okay, we'll do it again." So that stuck with me. And I'll tell you, within the past year, when I was a guest on someone else's podcast, a pretty professional podcaster, somebody who's been doing this for a long time, we got to the end. The recording hadn't happened, and it was going through Zoom. It didn't occur to me. Like I never, until after the fact, I never got that annoying pop-up notification of like, hey, this is going to be recording. Yeah. Click OK. Now, this person didn't really own up to it. They're like, oh, it was through another site. It runs through two systems. It'll be okay. But wouldn't you know, like about a week later, someone on their team followed up and said, like, yeah, we need to record that again. Right. So I'm not judging them for not being as open about it, because it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not judging that. But I think there was a lesson where me being on the other end of that stuck with me.
Yeah.
I had to be just as gracious with that person and say, and I use those exact words, a callback to 10, 15 years earlier. That's okay. We'll call it a practice session. Happy to do it again sometime. Right. So, if I hadn't been through that on the other side, I don't know. I might have been
perhaps that
I might have been annoyed.
Yeah. Perhaps the initial experience where you made the mistake, paved the way for how you would react to it when it happened on, the other side. So and that happens a lot too. Like, I think a lot is kind of put in front of us for us to eventually pay it forward, and I don't know, I'm a big believer in kind of higher spirit type of stuff. And so I do think that, sometimes we are meant to make certain mistakes because it's not even meant for us to have a learning lesson in that moment, but it's to prepare us to help somebody else when that event happens. So now on the other side to that, what would you say has been if you could recall, like, the number one highlight in your podcasting experience, some great moment that, really resonated for you and validated, for, the work that you're doing with being an author as well as your podcasting? Like, is there a story you can share that completely, validated everything that you're doing?
Well, there's been a lot of guests that I've been excited to interview. One that comes to mind, and this was a PR firm had reached out and had found me in my little podcast. Jim McCann, who was the founder of 1-800-Flowers or 1-800-Flowers.com. He's now the chairman. He's drifting, into retirement. And, he's somebody, I recognized his name and voice and face. He did a lot of commercials, maybe because I'm a Gen Xer, like in the late 80s, early 90s or whatever. So I thought, great. I always love the opportunity to interview a CEO. And like the stories he told in the podcast were validating. And think, he told stories of how they have a culture within 1-800-Flowers of sharing mistakes people have made in a customer service context for the purpose of learning from each other and improving how they are doing their work. And like, even to the point, I'm not sure I would do this if I were CEO of a company. Like Jim McCann was explaining how they would have like an award ceremony and give out an award for like the best mistake and try to be a little lighthearted about it. Right.
Yeah.
But I think, where you are in that balance of how much you're quote unquote celebrating, like some of that's just a function of culture, but I think as long as you're not punishing the mistakes, then you've got a fighting chance to learn from. So hearing from someone like that, who I really respected, of like, well, he's been doing that too. There were a lot of other companies that I've had exposure to that do that really well. But then I'll tell you the other thing that was funny about Jim McCann. So in the process of lining up the interview, sort of like you have, Adam, I normally have a pretty Loctite process of like, click here, self-schedule, it flows to my calendar, automated reminders go out. Like, it was a pretty Loctite process. The mistake I made was I thought I was being considerate and I'll save him some time. So I'm like, okay, no, Jim, I'm not going to ask you to do that. We did a pre-call. I've learned it's a mistake not to do the pre-call. Different stories there. But I thought I was doing him a favor. I would set it up manually, save him some clicks. He's a busy guy. Then I was emailing his team and I'd sent them the wrong date. And then I got flustered and I made some other mistake. And then I started thinking, oh no, like they're going to think this guy's a flake. And I hope they don't back out. So I told Jim that story, like at the end of our episode. And I don't think he was aware of any of that. He just kind of shrugged and he looked at me. He's like, you know what? It doesn't really matter. It's fine. Like he showed some grace, or at least kind of talking me off the proverbial ledge of where I felt embarrassed. That's probably a case where I was being harder on myself than the whole situation even merited. So to get that kind of pat on the back from him, and then to get an endorsement from him for the book, that's one, I guess, example or guest or story that was kind of gratifying in a number of ways.
And you bring up something else I think is really interesting, which is oftentimes, we make a mistake, or where we believe we've made a mistake and we're convinced that the other party caught us and, is making their own belief systems about us because of this mistake. But, it's a perception thing where, much like what you're just describing, like it sounded like, Jim wasn't even really aware that you had made a mistake, but like from your perspective, like you had already kind of built this narrative that, he knows that I completely dropped the ball. He's going to think I'm this flake. Like, I guess maybe comment a little bit on that perception of like, sometimes what we think in our own heads isn't what, other people are going to think as well. I was making an assumption, and a lot of the stories on the podcast, or even through my own work, a lot of mistakes are born from turns out to be a bad assumption, right? We make a decision or we take action based on something we think is true, but then turns out, not to be true. So I think there's a healthy
entrepreneurship habit, if not personal habit, of trying to be like pretty solid. Of like, if I say something out loud that sounds like a fact, to step back and question and say like, do I really know that, or am I making an assumption? Now, an assumption doesn't mean I'm wrong, but if we recognize there's an assumption, there's a risk I could be not completely correct. Like then you're driven to go test the assumption. Like I would rather make a mistake on a small scale, learn, replace that assumption with information, and then be able to succeed, right? So I could have checked earlier instead of kind of fretting about it with Jim's people. I mean, I did apologize, but like, I don't know how I could have checked that assumption. I probably should have put that out of my head. But there's all kinds of assumptions that we make in the course of doing business that sometimes we just need to stop and check them.
Yeah, certainly. All right, well, as we kind of come to a close here today, I want to ask a couple more questions. Number one is, for people that are listening here today that are, putting their concept of their podcast together and getting ready to launch, like what would be some advice that you would give to that person that will help them as they get started in their own podcasting journey?
Yeah. I think, there's maybe back to that point around thinking, okay, what assumptions am I making? And to think of what's the purpose for doing a podcast. If there's an assumption of, well, I'm in some professional setting or in a business, I'm going to do a podcast and it's going to drive leads and generate business. Okay, well, that's an assumption that maybe at some point you can only just go and test and see. And, the beauty of podcasting is that it's very low cost, low risk, to go and test an idea. And then if you're not getting the results that you had predicted, if you find out some assumption was not completely true, you can adjust, you can pivot. So there's this balance. So I think like with any startup idea, like you can go and try to ask people. You can try to get input. What do you think of the idea? How do you think this would play out? Is this appealing or not? Would you listen or not? Would you pay for this podcast if that's what someone's trying to do or not? You may get conflicting opinions, right? So then at some point, I think like as a creator, whether it's as a podcaster or as a book author, like at some point it's your name on it. You got to be the decider, if you will. But again, like, podcasting, I think is just gives such opportunities to iterate. And there's a lot of people who have relaunched a podcast season 2 with a slightly different focus. Or, sometimes people relaunch under a different name. Or there's all kinds of things we could try to iterate on to reach our goal, whether that's building a larger audience or attracting certain guests who we're looking to meet and network with. So, I mean, I think as you were saying in some of the introductory remarks, Adam, like, please, I would encourage people, please don't have this, kind of perfection paralysis.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm afraid to launch because something's not perfect. You know what? Yeah, it's not perfect. I cringe when I go back and listen to some of the stuff I did in 2006 and in the early days, both technically and as an interviewer. But yeah, I mean, you can try to test ideas, but then at some point, all you can do is really test it for real out in the market by launching, asking for feedback, and adjusting.
Okay. All right. Well, final 2 questions on the theme of discoveries. The first is just about podcasting and the podcasting, landscape as it evolves over time. Like, what are some discoveries that you've made, that you've noticed just about podcasting and the fact that you've been doing it for a while now? I mean, you can compare between the 2006 days to now. Like, what are some of those discoveries that you could point to that you've noticed just about podcasting between then and now?
I mean, I think there's a couple things. Like, for one, and as an avid podcast listener, it's so much easier to listen to podcasts now, like compared to downloading an MP3 file, putting it on my dedicated little tiny MP3 player. And like, the guidance back in the day was like episodes shouldn't be any longer than the typical commute, which is like 20 or 25 minutes. Because it was a real pain in the butt. If someone ever hit stop podcast, the chances of them ever picking up and resuming were probably pretty slim. But now I think like with smartphones and modern podcast apps and, the ability to either stream episodes or they're all, you open the app and it says, hey, here's where you left off. There's room for longer form interviews. So I don't know if I'm making a mistake, but my episodes have kind of crept from like 25 minutes to 45 or 50. I don't know if, that's a discovery. I don't know if everyone would agree with that. And then I think as recording technologies have changed, like I used to do it through Skype, and for a lot of reasons it was audio only. It wasn't even a matter of not publishing video. I wasn't even seeing my guest. But now in recent years, with platforms like you're using and Zoom and other ways that people can record, like for one, it's more natural to be on video. We're doing video meetings all the time.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, I'm discovering, I don't know, like, to me, I feel like sometimes doing the video version of the podcast may detract from the audio version. And I'll give you like 2 reasons why. So like we have a video connection right now, and I'm not picking on you, but I do the same thing. Like for those who are just listening, I'm talking and Adam's giving me great body language. He's nodding his head. That of course doesn't come through in the audio. Or there's times where somebody might say something funny and I give like kind of a hearty smile, or I lean back and now the noise cancellation has eliminated my laughter from the recording. I've seen that happen before. Part of me wonders, and maybe I just experiment with this, if I were to do a month of podcasting and say, no, we're going to leave the video off because there's far more people listening than there are watching on YouTube, and to force everything to be a purely audio interaction, I don't know. It's more
That's
of
a really
question
interesting.
than a
No,
discovery.
it's a really interesting point that you're making. I mean, a discovery, or just kind of like a, something that you became curious about, and I'm curious about it now that you bring it up myself, which is, what do we lose when we record in an audio-only environment versus a video environment? I mean, we were speaking before we hit record today about baseball. We're both kind of some baseball fans, and what the radio broadcasters do is much different than the TV broadcasters, because the radio broadcasters have to fill in a lot more emotion and analysis about the game than a TV broadcaster will do. And I think that kind of highlights some of what you're talking about, which is, what are we, by sharing, the video feed here as we are having the conversation, I think it's something that I became curious about just as you brought it up, is there something that I'm losing? Like, how does it actually change the conversation just given the format of how we're recording? So I know there's no real answer on that, but it's a curiosity thing, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's good and bad to it. There's a lot of advantages. I think you can connect with people by having the video. Even if I wasn't publishing the video anywhere, we can gesture. We can do things to, like, especially if there's more than 2 people involved in the podcast. But I don't know. There used to be kind of a certain intimacy where I'd have the microphone in the stand and I'd just be kind of leaning into the microphone. I don't know if that makes a difference, or I don't know. It's just that scene of like, I'm listening and maybe more intently. I don't know, and it's just it's different. It's more of a pondering than a discovery. Sorry.
Right. Yeah. All right. Final question, again on the theme of discovery, more kind of like personal in nature. As a podcaster, and just you've been doing this a while, are there discoveries that you've made about yourself personally that perhaps you weren't aware of, as you first started into podcasting?
I think it's partly a discovery and partly feedback from people, or maybe this is just something. It's hard to remember sometimes. I've been doing this for 17 years really regularly. I think I get feedback that I'm a good interviewer, or that I ask good questions, or if someone's doing a podcast tour, the questions I'm asking aren't the same 5 questions they're getting from everyone else. And I think some of that then has carryover effect into my professional life. I think that's a really good skill of being able to ask questions, to connect dots between different things that have been said, to come back to something that was said 20 minutes ago, and let's revisit that and dig deeper. I think that helps me sometimes as a coach and a consultant. So it's more of, I think, it's a benefit. I guess it's also a discovery. I don't think I would have anticipated at the beginning that would be a benefit of doing podcasting, of asking a question and then sometimes learning to step back and really let someone listen. I think that's helpful, not just as an interviewer, but again, like in the workplace.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Well, Mark, this has been great to get to know you. I'm super excited to pick up a copy of your book and to check that out. So thank you so much for being a guest here today.
Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it.
Mark Graban is an author, speaker, and consultant whose latest book, The Mistakes That Make Us, Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation, is available now on Amazon. He's also the author of the award-winning book, Lean Hospitals, Improving Quality, Patient Safety, and Employee Engagement, and others, including Measures of Success, React Less, Lead Better, Improve More. He serves as a consultant through his company, Constancy Inc., and is also a senior advisor for the technology company KaiNexus. Mark hosts podcasts including Lean Blog Interviews and My Favorite Mistake. You can find out more about Mark in our episode show notes. Are you stuck trying to take your podcast to the next level? Do you need help with marketing or post-production? At EIQ Media Group, we offer podcast coaching, production, editing, and marketing support. Head on over to www.eiqmediallc.com to learn more. If you're enjoying Beyond the Microphone, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening, as well as to our YouTube channel. You can find links to all of these in our episode show notes. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time on Beyond the Microphone.
Beyond the Microphone is produced and distributed by EIQ Media Group, LLC. Elevate your emotional IQ with podcasts and content focused on entrepreneurship, overcoming adversity, stories of emotional courage, women's health, aging, and more.